We're a network or umbrella organization which gathers 200 NGOs active everywhere in the world on media assistance or media development. Today we're here to discuss independence in journalism. With us, we have 4 speakers. On my right, Jeremy Drucker from Transition Online, that is a media assistance group active in Central and Eastern Europe to help promote independent journalism, quality journalism, and also founder of Press Start, a new crowdfunding platform for media, in particular in those countries where press freedom is not exactly what it should be. Then we have Kate Ferguson, researcher from the East Anglia University, whose topic of preference is identity-based violence. And among the factors that are central to the studies are media. And she produced recently a paper, a review of evidence, called Countering Violent Extremism Through Media and Communication Strategies. She will talk to us about that later on. Then Samir Padania on my left, who has had multiple caps since I've known him. Lately, Samir was working for the Open Society Foundations on the independent journalism program, and he's also worked with media assistance groups and human rights groups such as Witness or Panos. And his interest, and please correct me later on if it's not accurate enough, is in how digital technologies are disrupting journalism and other factors in our global society. And lastly, Gabriella Manuli, who is Deputy Director of the Global Investigative Journalism Network, an organization that is booming and blooming since 2.5 years now, and who is from Argentina and also investigating journalism herself. So welcome and thank you for being with us. The first question, and please be snappy about this because we have another 3 to go before having an exchange with the room, is from your perspective, and I will start with Jeremy, tell us about yourself a little bit and what is your vision from your perspective of a founder of a crowdfunding platform. What is your vision of independence in journalism?
Okay, thank you. So obviously a very broad topic. Maybe just a bit about my background. As you can tell probably by my accent, I'm originally from New York City, but I have been living in Prague for about 20 years now, running a media development organization that provides training to journalists throughout Central and Eastern Europe. And we also run a nonprofit news site covering the 30 countries of the region. So I guess I've seen a lot over the last 20 years in this field. And talking about independence, I think it always more or less comes back to finances. My organization, though, has been a nonprofit from the beginning. And we've seen also the value of training and journalists, and I think in many ways independence starts with journalism training, because we have seen even 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, it's still very, very difficult to find quality journalists across the region with a strong journalistic background, educational background, and ethical background. And I think before you even get into the financing aspect, you have to start with the individual and be sure that they have the kind of background where they understand what you should take money for and what you shouldn't take money for. So we really started our approach with training. But over the last, I would say 10, 15 years, we've grown this training business, if you want to call it that. But we really see the limitations, because you can train journalists in ethics, journalism skills, some of the specialties that have popped up, new media, social media, data journalism. But in our experience, it really comes back to the financing. A lot of the journalists that we train, these are really smart, bright people. They go back to their home countries, often repressive countries, and there just isn't money for them to do their work. The independent publications that are out there are struggling, they're donor dependent, They don't have enough business because too many of the business people are afraid of contributing to an independent publication because they might feel the political repercussions from that. So in many ways, what we're trying to do with this crowdfunding platform, which I'll probably talk about more later because I was told to be snappy and we have more speakers here, is we're trying to solve, in a way, that market failure. So locally, there just isn't enough money to support quality journalism. Our view is the money is out there, it's just not local. So we're trying to connect people around the world who have that kind of money and believe in independent media, independent journalism, to solve this local market failure and invest in those local talented journalists who have already solved the ethical question. They know what you should take money for and what you shouldn't take money for. They have the skills to do the work. They're brave. They're able to fight the powers that be, but they simply don't have enough money to do the job. And they have to take odd jobs. They go to work in McDonald's, drive an Uber, whatever it is, just to make ends meet. And it's a huge loss for independent journalism because there are the people out there. There just isn't the financing to support them. So maybe I'll stop there for now and then get into some of the details later. Thank you.
From the academic perspective and your area of study, what does it ring like? Independence, what does it say for you?
Thank you. So just a little bit about the report from which I'm speaking on. This was a paper that was looking at the effectiveness and the evidence base available about the effectiveness of current media and communications strategies that are being employed either in the media sector or in a policy sense with the challenge of violent extremism. And one of the things that I found was that it is so important that the messenger of information is trusted, is credible, is thought to be legitimate in the eyes of the audience. And so that really elevates the capacity and the role for quality independent journalists in this very urgent policy challenge and real world threat of extremism. I come at, I guess, the broad scope of extremism from the perspective of how identity divisions and identity-driven violence emerge. And so whether we're talking about extremism or any identity-based prejudice or really sort of mass violence like genocide, which is at the root something that is legitimized through grievance and identity-held beliefs, the capacity of media to either facilitate or encourage that downward spiral, that unknitting of society is actually very well known, but also the capacity of media to actually counteract some of those processes is also very important. And so that's sort of the framing of how I'll be, I guess, discussing with you today a little bit more, and hopefully in the question and answers later, is that having grassroots voices in countries and communities that are really facing the challenges of identity divisions is really, really important. And then also having quality independent journalism that are reporting the issues of extremism and identity divisions from a responsible and informed position, and also reporting the policies that are being pursued, I think is really a crucial element to meeting that challenge.
Thank you. Samir?
Thanks. So I'm going to talk primarily from the perspective of somebody who's most recently worked as a grant maker, looking at lots and lots and lots of different kinds of journalistic initiatives, different, from startups to, mature organizations to venture capital-backed accelerators to all kinds of different mechanisms that are trying to strengthen and support the independence of media more broadly. And until January, I was working at the Open Society Foundations, as Caroline said. And in my 3.5 years there, part of my role was to support, track, identify experimentation in journalism around the world. And really all of that was angled towards how are different people trying to experiment in order to preserve and protect and strengthen and extend the independence of journalism as a sort of core enterprise in society at a time when it is from so many different angles under attack, having its lunch eaten, or all of these different phrases that people come out with. And the nature of that independence, I think, has shifted radically in the last 10 to 15, 20 years, whatever sort of horizon you want to put on it. In the past, maybe the principal thing, you might argue would have been principally around editorial independence. It was a scarcer environment for information. Competition was less immediately, hour to hour. I think that practicing independence now in the field of journalism is a much more complex, much more shifting kind of task for any sort of journalistic outfit of, whether it's the smallest or the largest. And I think everybody is wrestling with these challenges. And, I think some of the areas where I think, independence is kind of being disaggregated itself, around what platform you use to publish. There's been a debate going on recently about should you publish just to Facebook and to social sites, or should you also have your own destination website, destination or distribution? These debates are constantly being churned over. People are outsourcing their comment moderation. Others are holding it entirely in-house. These, I think, in a way, they seem like fringe issues, but actually when you aggregate them and you look at all these different pieces, they're really what communicates a publication's own independence, a belief in the strength of its journalists, a belief in the strength of its own institution and its own systems. Distribution is an enormous question. I'm sure we'll get onto that. Even data. I think one of the things that news organizations, journalism organizations at the moment are being, this every day, if you follow things like Neiman Lab and so on, you're encountering stories, analyses, case studies all the time to do with engagement. There are, 3 in the last 24 hours. All of them explaining, interesting new ways that news organizations are finding new sources of revenue, new sources of independence and relationship through cultivating communities, very deep communities. Could be local, could be thematic or whatever. One of the things that I think will probably come and start to hit on independence then, or at least the perception of independence, is how then all that data is held, the ethics of an organization, how news organizations, which are kind of stewards of public interest in many respects, how they themselves are using and stewarding that data and making money off it in order to sustain their own resources. And I think, those sorts of things are still a little bit buried and they haven't really come to the fore in discussion. And then, of course, you've got very obviously financial independence, and that, funding for journalism is in crisis. It's being rethought, and I think funders, as we'll come later in the session, we'll talk a bit more about, what funders and different kinds of sources of money are sort of emerging to support that kind of independence. But I think what it demands is also a very different kind of journalism and journalism organizations. I think really the terrain has shifted a lot, but it continues to shift. So I think journalism is constantly now redefining what independence means.
Thank you. Gabby, investigative journalism has been making the news quite so in the last 2-3 days. What can you say about that?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say a few words about GIJN and what we do. We are a network that our members are organizations that are dedicated to investigative journalism, so we are not a reporting organization, but we provide services, and we are a global hub for our members, but also we aim to the global community. We give resources to investigative journalists and any journalist that is interested in investigative stuff. Now we have 128 members in 57 countries, and we keep growing. Every 2 years, we organize the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. The first one was in 2001, and the next one will be next year in South Africa. And this year, we are very excited to organize the second regional conference on investigative journalism in Asia, in Nepal. That's an area where they really need a lot of help to try to strengthen investigative journalism. So we provide resources. We are on social media. You can follow us at GIJN on Twitter, etc. So about my vision on independence in journalism, first of all, I would like to quote David Kaplan, the GIJN executive director. He always quotes an old editor of him that he always said that there were never good old times. Like sometimes you would think to idealize the past, but investigative journalism has always been struggle inside the newsroom, outside the newsroom. It's very expensive, it's time consuming, and it was always struggling with funds. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. But having said that, there is also good news, and you could see a great example this week on the Panama Leaks. That was a project of ICIJ, that is one of our members, along with a lot of our other members worldwide. And it was huge, and it shows the importance on investigative journalism and how technology is changing everything and how the paradigm is changing. Now it's more collaborative. There are tools. We are out there. But also, as technology is changing and we have more tools and we have more collaboration, also the backlash on investigative journalism is very, very strong, and we need to fight that. And something that, of course, we will like to talk later, but the funding on investigative journalism is very, very low, and we need really all of us to make the case about the impact on investigative journalism and how we need more funding and the importance on investigative journalism for democracy, and basically independence, on trying to being able to publish whatever you found, and no censorship, and most importantly, no self-censorship.
Thank you, Gabby. In terms of format, we'll go through another 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have a Q&A with the room. And our director, Amain Mana, who's sitting here now tweeting, will be moderating that part of the discussion. So we've touched upon already my second question, which is what are the threats and challenges to independent journalism in today's context? And from your perspective, how do you see this? So I would like to ask in a more free way, whoever wants to start, to dive a little more into what you started to talk about in terms of threats and challenges. I've heard about the funding, the very low funding for investigative journalism. I've heard about the influence also of governments or foreign governments into funding when it comes to having an agenda of counter-radicalization, for example. What kind of challenge does that bring to journalists themselves? Crowdfunding, that seems like a solution. Is that a solution for everything? In which cases, and so on? So, please.
Yeah, I guess I can start. Maybe I can tell a few more details about the platform. Is it possible to get it up on the screen? A few slides? Okay. So this is the site I was talking about, and as I said initially, we're trying to solve this, as it were, market failure. Part of the problem, though, that we see in terms of bringing local quality journalists to an international audience is simply crowdfunding is still, even though we've heard about it in Europe and elsewhere, it still is not a widespread concept. So in a lot of the countries that we're talking about in the developing world, countries in transition, journalists have probably never heard of crowdfunding, let alone Kickstarter or any of these big platforms. So our goal and our part of the solution, and I should really emphasize here, as Caroline said, crowdfunding is a potential solution. I'm not one of those people who's going to get up here telling you it's going to solve the crisis in financing journalism. I think it's part of the solution. It's one possible revenue stream. But I think we're quite far away from saying crowdfunding is going to solve the crisis with funding independent journalism around the world. I think what we're trying to do is a real experiment. And I say that very openly. What we're really betting on is that people around the world will have empathy for supporting independent journalists around the world if those independent journalists are able to tell their stories. And a lot of what we'll be doing is actually storytelling. So we will be identifying with our partners, local journalists throughout the world, that have been deemed worthy, quality, whatever you want to call it. So it will be a very select group. And there are obviously questions about how we're going to select those people and what that means, and we can probably get into that later. But what we're hoping is that if these people are able to tell their stories, how they're struggling out there in mostly repressive countries, because we are targeting only countries that have so-called partly free media or not free media, that people around the world will appreciate what these people are doing, they value independent journalism, and they will donate, even if that journalism is not directly affecting them. That's what's very new about what we're trying to do. So the profiles will look something like this. You have here up on the screen. This is a journalist from Lebanon that was recommended by one of our partners that Aman here represents. And he writes often about government transparency issues and corruption in public services and things like that. So every journalist will have a video telling their story. Every journalist will talk about what type of stories they want to write, and then they will be raising money for one specific story at the outset that they want to do. What we're saying here as well is that this is beyond traditional crowdfunding. So most of you have heard of crowdfunding. You've probably even seen it with journalism. A journalist going up and saying, I want to do this one story, and please support my cause by contributing $20, $50, $100, whatever it might be. What we want to do is to create more of multiple ways for visitors to donate. So you can sponsor a specific journalist, but if you like the concept in general, you would contribute to some kind of fund that would then be used to kind of top up the journalists that have not yet reached their goals. So the idea here is to develop this audience worldwide into something more like subscribers to the concept. And I think that's part of the solution we're talking about as well. People around the world really have to see independent journalism, investigative journalism, quality journalism as something like a public good that is difficult to finance commercially and something which people should contribute to and should see it as something which, even if it doesn't affect me locally, it could ultimately lead to a collapse of a regime, to disgruntled populations halfway across the globe. And that those failed states, which might be failed partly because there is no journalism to bring the authorities to account, to monitor the governments, that can affect me, whether I'm sitting in Iowa in the US, here in Perugia in Italy, Japan, wherever. In this interconnected world, people have to understand that the lack of independent media halfway across the world can, in a way, ultimately affect me locally. And I think that extends not only to just normal people willing to contribute, but as we've seen in the US, the idea of philanthropists contributing to independent media has changed dramatically over the last 15 or 20 years. So it used to be obviously that rich people would support hospitals, orphans, environment, things like that. There's been a huge movement now in the US, and I believe in the UK as well, for wealthy people to understand that they should also contribute for the better good of mankind, if we want to make it a little dramatic, to independent journalism and to keeping newspapers like the Washington Post alive. Jeff Bezos bought that, as you know, from Amazon, and other media, much smaller, from the smallest to the biggest. So I think that's part of what we're talking about, and that's part of the changing mentality that we're trying to build upon on an individual basis. But I think to solve this question we're talking about, ultimately people do have to understand, as I said before, a public good. This is something which everyone should invest in because it's very tough to come up with commercial solutions. And I guess that would be the last point I make, is simply, I think there's something we have to differentiate as well. It's not simply supporting independent journalism, because I've been running an independent site for the last 17 years. And through all we've done, we've had sponsors, we charge subscriptions. I can honestly say that we have been independent all that time. No one has called the shots about anything we've written. But I wouldn't say we have done the best job we could in producing quality journalism across the region because we've always been underfunded. So you can be independent, you can start up a blog, you can have a great Facebook page, you can call that independent, but are you really able to do the quality journalism without the financing necessary to do it? So I think there's doing quality independent journalism versus simply doing independent journalism. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. That reminds me of the changing mentality phrase. Reminds me that lately the GFMD has been quite involved into a big campaign, and well, we hope it did push for that result. It's not just us, of course. The new United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that are already now in effect, and everybody's scratching their heads as to how it will be implemented, do have a goal or a specific target that is on access to information, and that is a mentality change, because so far there was not a recognition of the role of media and access to information at such a broad level, and hopefully there will be at some point some connection also with the made with the funding revenues and the responsibility, the global responsibility that we have, each of us. Kate.
Yeah, that was a really great lead-in, actually, because I find it really interesting that the United Nations Secretary General report on countering terrorism actually really does draw out the importance of media and the importance of independent media, trusted media, inclusive media, and it sets out a set of, I think, very strong recommendations that really do identify and tap into the capacity of all forms of media and media platforms, but responsible and accountable journalism in tackling these challenges. That's the first time I've actually ever seen such recommendations spelt out in this way, and I think that that's something really positive. On the negative side is, in that same report, it also includes a provision for the need for a strategic communications response and counter-narratives. And so that's the tension that really is at the heart of my current research and my current paper, is this challenge coming from primarily the policy and security sectors, really trying to champion a strategic communications approach to the challenges of violent extremism, and now bleeding out into a more broad approach to communications. And the phrase "an information war" is something I'm hearing more and more, even though I'm not entirely sure if I understand in what way that term is being deployed. It's a very confrontational term. The behaviors of, say, Russia and how a lot of Russian state media is produced appears to be provoking an odd retaliatory response in some policy sectors. And that is being reinforced by an existing dominant conversation in Western democracies about responding to the threat of violent extremism through strategic communications and counter-narratives. And that really does pose a challenge and a threat to other forms of communication and media-oriented strategies and also just sort of platforms that exist. There is certainly a funding issue there. There are certainly concerns that funding is being diverted away from, say, media assistance or media development to this strategic communications area, which I was able to find no empirical evidence actually is having a demonstrable impact either on the audiences or on reducing the real world threat. There are another couple of challenges I'd probably like to emphasize here. One is populism, and the populist press poses a challenge, I think, to journalists who want to report on these very emotive and very dominant issues. When we hear extremism being talked about, on the whole in the UK, the loudest voices are not necessarily those that are the most informed. So that's a sort of challenge, I guess, to the independent journalists, to those with the sort of will and the skill and the bravery, really, to sort of try and seek out that access. And of course, that comes into all of the problems that we've just been hearing about training and funding. And I think everyone else on the panel is far better placed to sort of talk about those challenges. But that is something really key. And so I think that while there is a threat to the capacity of independent media within this particularly preventing violent extremism and policy context, actually the inclusion of these media recommendations in the Secretary General's report, I think that that's a sort of glimmer of hope, and I think potentially there is space for a conversation to take place in policy and funding sectors that can say, look, this stuff works, independent journalism works. When you speak with authority and integrity, people listen and that has impact. So maybe when we move on to solutions, that's something I can expand on. But it's not all grim, but the challenges are really significant, I think.
Thank you, Kate. I must admit that as representing media assistants, this findings are quite striking, and it really prompts actually some concerns and some questions as to should media assistants engage into any kind of counter something. And I would really look forward to also having concrete cases from your study later on in the conversation, just to get a sense of what this really means also on the ground and locally, and what's happening when you're in media in Syria or in Ukraine or in the Baltics, and you get this kind of request, or you engage into that kind of work. Samir.
So, although what I'm about to say, is focused on threats and challenges, I do think that this is a very exciting, just from the vantage point I've been privileged to sit in for the last 3 years, it's an incredibly exciting time for journalism in many ways, because people really are thinking about challenges across the globe in many of the countries that Jeremy talked about problems that Kate has talked about, and in many, as partners in networks that Gabi has talked about. So I think there is a lot happening, and people are thinking about and engaging with the challenges. So it's not a bleak picture like, Lord of the Rings kind of thing. But at the same time, there are traditional challenges that haven't gone away. Safety across the board is still a major issue for journalists, independent journalists across the world. And it's a multi-dimensional safety issue. I'm not expert in these things, and I hope, Ayman and others who are more expert in these things later on will bring them up, and what some of the responses are, and certainly among you all. But, whether it's on I was reading something this morning about India, and, use of sedition and libel and defamation is on the up in India. This is the world's largest democracy, to silence journalists, independent journalists. Turkey, another democracy on the fringes of Europe, critical to so many things strategically and geopolitically, is using this as cover to further, after years of hammering on the independent journalism field, continuing to entrench, a very, very, let's call it, a regressive attitude towards the media, taking over a newspaper recently. So, those sorts of threats, physical, legal, digital, they're all there. They're still there. That's the environment in which most maybe journalists around the world are working in. Not to mention surveillance and all of the other things that, I get to have the downer bit of the conversation. But more broadly, civic space is also being cracked down on. So it's not just journalism; it's civil society more broadly. It's free expression, free assembly, and free association. There's a general crackdown on open space in many, many, many countries, and ones that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see on the list. So that's a backdrop against which, it makes it harder for journalism in many ways to try and push back, to generate revenue, to get public support, as Jeremy was saying, with advertisers who are maybe reticent about putting ads in publication or on a website in case it's seen as an endorsement of an opposition view. All of that kind of stuff we know pretty well. But the new threats, I think, are the ones that we're really having to think about harder, and nobody has a solution yet, because these are really tricky and interlocking threats. The dependence on sort of technical platforms, technical providers, big tech, the Googles, Facebooks, Twitters, and so on. That is a positive relationship in many senses, because it's allowing people to reach audiences at scale in so many different ways. But at the same time, they are large and hegemonic corporations that have they have a lot of power. So the relationship between in the journalism field with those companies is both to involve themselves and to try out products and so on, but also to try and understand how can we preserve some independence and so on. And I think that is an ongoing and narrowing field for independence, and it's a real threat. There's political, we discussed, financial, attacks on sources of funding, foreign funding. In India, for example, it's not possible for journalism. You cannot do it. In Turkey, it's extremely difficult to do. Grants that are given sometimes are returned. There's an extreme pressure even on sources of funding that were traditionally available. And crowdfunding in many places is not, the legal structures around it are very, very difficult then, to navigate and so on. Many of the crowdfunding sites, Kickstarter, for example, were here last year doing a workshop, and it's not easy for them to operate in certain countries. You have to have, I think it was I forget which Balkan country it was, they wanted to set up a media center. They had to have somebody in the US act as the recipient of the funds and then have the funds transferred over, right? So, even in newer solutions, it's still difficult. And then I think the one I really wanted to pick out that I think, once you start drilling into, I think it can seem quite an overwhelming challenge. Fact-checking in the last 2-3 years has become, if you're not aware, there are many, many new fact-checking units, independent fact-checking units around the world. In the 70s, 70-something sites that are active throughout the year, 60-plus countries, doing extraordinary work. Innovations in Argentina and in Ukraine and here, there, and everywhere. And there's a couple of people here. I think there's a panel later in the festival on it. Already, the weapons or the methods of fact-checking, this independent fact-checking, are being taken up by, for example, political groups or advocacy groups within society, who are taking those tools and weaponizing them and using them to, for want of a better word, pollute or control the information sphere and add to the amount and quantity of data and of information and of standards and everything else. So in a sense, that proliferation of sources makes the role and trust in journalists even more critical, and holding on to that and reinforcing it is something that I think is, as I was saying before, I think a constant and shifting challenge. The fact-checking movement a year ago, you'd sort of say, well, you know what, they've pretty much nailed how to start, how to do this in lots of different countries. But already in the US, it's becoming an incredibly difficult battle with other kinds of groups. So I think that, and that's without factoring in things like, machine intelligence and bots and all of those sorts of things. So you get the positive bit. Maybe, or even more.
Okay, I don't know if I can give a positive. If I have to talk about threats and challenges, specifically for investigative journalism, I think I can just talk all day or maybe all festival. So I'm going to mention a few, but this is not a comprehensive list, of course. We face so many challenges. The change in financial model, the technology, the change in technology is also a challenge because you need to be up to date, you need to have the resources. Of course, safety issues, violent assaults, legal harassments, lack of access to public records and documents, scarce resources, lack of good quality standards, and lack of training in a lot of parts of the world. And of course, one of the biggest challenges funding. I already talked about that, but if you go to the numbers and you see the amount of money that goes in general to media development around the world, the portion of that money that goes to investigative journalism is really, really low. There is a study from CIMA, the Center for International Media Assistance, and the estimate is like from the big pie, just less than 2% goes to investigative journalism. Then it's really hard to get funded, and when you go to donors and they really want you to show your impact, and sometimes it's really difficult to quantify the impact of investigative journalism, because it's not the number of clicks or the number of people that access your stories, but actually sometimes you save lives, you change the world, but that's really long term. So that's a problem. Then you can also, there are a lot of challenges that you face when you are thinking of non-profits that do investigative journalism. There are a lot of challenges that you face at the heart of the non-profit that later on I would like to talk about some possible solutions. But first of all, sometimes journalists are they are really good at what they do, but they are really bad at the business side of journalism. And they even think that earning money, they need to think that earning money is not a bad thing, that you really need to do it. They have lack of expertise in fundraising or in marketing, or I was talking with some colleagues now, even things that you never think about, but if you are going to do sometimes a crowdfunding campaign, you need to think of e-commerce, you need to think of a lot of issues that as a journalist you never studied or you never thought. And if you are not good at it, you need to know that you can hire someone or you need to find money for that. But that's also a problem, because sometimes the grants that you get through foundations are for projects, but they don't pay for capacity, they don't pay you for the office space, they don't pay you for staff. So that's where you need to think what to do. And also, if you think about crowdfunding is not for everybody. It's crazy the amount of time and the amount of effort it takes. And if you have a small organization and you want to keep doing journalism, you need to work full time on a crowdfunding campaign. And sometimes for our members, it's difficult to do crowdfunding because they don't really have a concrete product to offer. But we can talk on a positive note in the next question or later on about what can we do, because of course there is a lot to be done.
Actually, if you can bounce on that, going to the last couple of questions that will contract into one, because we really want to be having time for exchanges, is so we've heard a lot about the difficulties and the challenges, but what can we do? What is GIJN doing? What should we also do as journalists and academics? I mean, people represented in this room, donors, to mitigate this and having a perspective view also in the future with the trends that we're seeing, and that might even develop in the next 5 to 10 years. What do you see? Where's the silver lining there?
Well, there is a lot to be done. Us specifically at GIJN, we are trying to help to make the case for the need of investigative journalism. We had a full project on impact of investigative journalism. We are trying to give resources to our members that when they go fundraising, they can show why it's important to fund. Our members really need to it's really important to diversify funding. You can't just rely on one foundation to give you the money, because that can come and go. And then if from the organizational perspective, I think you really need to think out of the box, and I will give you some examples out there. First of all, apart from doing reporting, you can offer a lot of things. Apart from publishing your stories, you can offer services, you can do consulting, you can be a fixer. When something happens in your country, you can have an arm of journalists, a group of journalists that can be fixers and can help people to do that. You can do training and charge for that. When you do your stories, you can syndicate them. You can charge from the stories. Sometimes it's it works giving them for free because you get a lot of publicity, but sometimes it works to charge for your stories. You can do special events. You can do lunch talks with the editors. I don't know, the Texas Tribune in the US does a trivia night. They do events. There is an organization in the US here that is doing investigative reporting plus theater. So you can go to the theater and watch an investigative story. The Wisconsin Watch, also in the US, they mix investigative journalism plus art, and they did the sculptures, an artist did the sculptures based on the stories, and they tour the country and they show the problems. These are just some examples. Crowdfunding, there is a lot to be done, and there are great examples. I don't know, in Hungary, at Lazzo and the XRTCs, they did successful crowdfunding campaigns. Corrective and crowd reporting in Germany. Publica in Brazil, for example, they did crowdfunding, and Natalia Viana was talking in one conference, a global conference, about how they organize a carnival party for the readers. So, like, it doesn't have to be boring. I mean, you can do crowdfunding, you can have a party, you can have a carnival party. Of course, in Brazil, it's difficult to match that fun, but you can try. You can sell databases. If you get access to public records, you can sell that information from other people to use it, not journalists, but other organizations, companies might be interested. You can get a paywall. You can have stories paid per read. I think it's like thinking out of the box. Let me explain that. I'm not saying that funding from organizations and foundations is not important. That's the main thing, because investigative journalism is really expensive and it's vital for democracy, and it will always need money from philanthropy, donors, etc. But then there are also things that you can do. So basically, I hope it was more positive note.
I'm just wondering if anyone already has made the charts on how much money was and tax evasion has been uncovered with the Panama leaks versus the actual funding that goes to investigative journalism.
I went to an event last year where somebody actually proposed that investigative journalism, there should be a fund set up for investigative journalism where a percentage of the proceeds recovered by tax authorities or other authorities should go into a fund that then is sort of administered as a blind fund for investigative journalism. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's going to fix deficits, isn't it? So a couple of things. I mean, one, going back to, to talk about the sort of, to build off what Gabriella's saying with some of the strategies, I think, having looked at a lot of things that people are trying to develop, one of the things that's really apparent right now as a sort of bulwark against sort of a lot of the different kinds of challenges that are being faced is this, broadly termed engagement. People are, from the largest to the smallest, again, are sort of I think are placing a bet on their members, their audiences, the people who read them or watch them. They are the font of all income. They are the font of stories. They're the font of their support in times when they're being aggressed or attacked. That deep engagement and understanding of a group of people, however large or small that might be, whether you're talking about a hyper-local site or a national newspaper, is really at the moment, I think, the thing that most of the people who seem to be thinking in a very forward-thinking way and a very holistic way are addressing that. And that includes sort of, social and everything else, but it seems to be, a very sort of deep source of interest right now, and a bet that people are making. And if you look at examples like De Correspondent in the Netherlands, which gets bandied around an awful lot, I had a very long conversation with their founder recently, and I think a lot of their thinking really does resonate. It was a break with a sort of cognitive model of news that they didn't like anymore. They sort of said, if we're was anyone really happy in the journalism organizations that we were all working for? You know, people were doing jobs they didn't really enjoy, writing things they didn't like, that sort of thing. And so if they were to redesign something, what would they do? And I think this was a really interesting question to pose. You know, in this environment, you can basically make what you want. So they had that opportunity, and they did it, and they now have, I think, 46,000 paying subscribers, paying something like €60 a year, I think. And they have gift subscriptions and events and, you know, individual meetups with people and, you know, all the correspondents who are given a lot of freedom to pursue what they want. You know, and there are models like this, but there are a lot of different models around at the moment that I think are allowing people to build and then preserve and kind of express what independence means in this new arena. It doesn't mean not taking advertising. It doesn't mean not having sponsorship. But it does involve a lot of the things that Gabriella was talking about. Particularly, I think one of the things also that's emerging really is a way of strengthening the bonds between independent publications, particularly, and their audiences. There's a great example in Miami, which is sort of spread it to lots of sort of smaller cities, is the New Tropic. And they have events that are really, in a sense, civic engagement events. But they gain stories at them. The stories feed databases and editorial for them for a long time. They have very, very solid knowledge of particular localities. They're the only media organization covering them in that depth. They're also fun because they're doing things, you know, they have drink sponsors and this, that, and the other. They're doing immersive experiences, but they're also doing day-to-day journalism about those places. And that is not accessible and not found elsewhere. And I think models like that where, you know, you don't have to be the biggest. You don't have to be the strongest. You know, somebody told me recently, I'm doing a piece of work for OSF at the moment. I'm looking at how experimentation happens. And one of the fascinating things was, you know, or not fascinating, it's sort of, I kind of wanted somebody to say it, and somebody did say it to me. It was, you know, stop looking at The Guardian. Please stop looking at The Guardian as your model for all innovation. Please stop looking at the New York Times. Don't read, you know, sure, read the innovation report, but look at the people who are the challengers, the smaller sites, the second, third, fourth in a market. They're the ones who have to pedal hardest to try and survive. They're the ones who are having to really think about, oh my God, we need this, we need that. You know, so those are, I think, a real site for sort of innovation and attempts to sort of reach independence in a different way. And then I think the last thing I think is interesting is an opportunity for journalism, and this goes back to some of those issues that I was talking about as threats and challenges. I think journalism, and independent journalism in particular, has a real opportunity to set the agenda around these things. We have a public platform already. So in order to use that to act in as, you know, as agenda setting a way as possible, whether it's, you know, pushing forward, you know, The Guardian trumpeted open journalism a while back. I think there's still a lot of room to work out what that really means. There are lots of people practicing open journalism in lots of different ways, but I think it's something that is still up for grabs, and independent journalism has an opportunity to do that. Ethics, I think, again, you know, around data and so on, as I was saying before, these are areas where actually a lot of people are not innovating and not setting the agenda, and journalism has an opportunity with its unique perspective and approach and its role in society to actually model a kind of behavior and set the tone of the conversation, which I think might also engender that kind of support and public support that's, you know, it's long term, but I think, you know, there are lots of opportunities like this, you know, and we can talk about funding later.
Thank you. If you could be, please, maybe a bit concise in your final intervention, so we still have a bit of time. We'll have 20 minutes to interact with them. It's less than I hope for, but let's leave some time for this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are some sort of strategies and some options to override the challenges that I set out in this particular context of the issue and challenge and threat of violent extremism, but also as a broader challenges of human rights and the role of the media in that conversation and in that agenda. I think I would sum it up as, I think the objective is to be able to convey in an evidence-based way that investigative and independent journalism, it's part of a media toolkit. It's just one aspect of a way in which the media, as a very broad concept, can contribute in a very positive way to responding to the challenges and setting the agenda and providing information. But even that media toolbox is only part of a very, very complex development, governance, human rights agenda as well. And that certainly in many of the conversations that I'm having in sort of more policy-oriented circles, I think it's really important to sort of accept the really great capacity of media in all its forms to set the agenda, but also its limits. No message and no set of information is definitively going to be able to adequately respond to real-world threats like violent extremism. And accepting that is really important, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't a lot of very positive things that can be done. You asked me to be brief, and you also asked me to talk a bit about media assistance, so I shall do that, and then any other aspects you think I can cover, just come at me with questions now or later. So thinking about independent journalism as part of a long-term solution is really important. And also recognizing the capacity of independent and other forms of media to really address the root causes of these real world and policy challenges that I'm engaging with. And things like identity and exclusion, which come up again and again as root causes and drivers, and whether we call it radicalization or vulnerability to becoming engaged in violent discourse and violent actions, really can be addressed through media providers and journalists providing an alternative, providing an inclusive message. Training, really, really important. Equipping not just those producing media and information, but those consuming it about how and why we do that. And that can go right from very small children to almost everyone participating in this conversation and everyone engaging in these challenges. Working in partnership with local respected and legitimate voices in media assistance, either in community or on a bigger scale, is so important. Because I'm not suggesting for a minute that any media assistance package is going to provide a solution and be positive. It has to be developed with a research base and evidence base and address the certain nuanced and very local and specific processes that are going on in the human rights sort of conversation in that context. Working with all of those different stakeholders is really key to ensuring that any program of media assistance actually has the desired result of developing skills and independence and integrity. I guess I'll just, as an example, talk about former Yugoslavia maybe, where in response to state-owned media platforms in the 1990s, grassroots and also externally supported journalists came together and produced a whole sort of plethora of investigative and independent research platforms that have over the last 20 years really contributed to exposing political corruption, providing information on the prosecution or otherwise of war crimes committed in those wars, of discussing and placing the human rights agenda in a different space that wasn't already being done so. It's very difficult to measure the impact of processes like that, but when you take a long view of 20 years of the former Yugoslav states, those platforms have been incredibly important, and some received external money from the EU and elsewhere, and because of that there are elements to this day that do not trust those media providers because they're not thought of being independent. But you're always going to have that challenge, and it's about how you address that and how you really are transparent and accountable and recognize that by working with local partners and letting the grassroots voices shape that conversation, and being integral to that program, whether it's of media assistance or media with development goals or independent journalism. I think that that's really the key, not just to preventing violent extremism, but to preventing conflict and to addressing the human rights agenda and governance and development. And it's something that, if framed in the right way, and if we can start having a more joined up conversation between sectors, between media experts, independent journalists, and some of these policymakers and funders and development actors, then I think that there's a real opportunity for all different kinds of media approaches and tools to be prioritized and championed without necessarily contaminating independence and legitimacy.
Thank you. 2 minutes, please, if you can.
Okay, yeah, I guess I have to be really, really brief. So I would just summarize basically saying what the earlier panelists said. I think it's really about journalists and the donors learning new skills. Gabriella had mentioned before with crowdfunding and with journalists, investigative journalists trying to sell themselves. We're planning to launch next month, and we can already see, as she said, you can have the best investigative journalists out there, but a lot of times they just don't know how to present themselves in front of a camera, in text. They just don't have those skills. And that's one thing which we're going to be having to do, is just provide a lot of coaching to do that. It's natural. Why would they need to have those skills earlier? They're great investigative reporters. Why would they necessarily need to try to sell themselves in front of an international audience? So I think that's part of learning the new skills. We as an organization, it's true what Gabriella said, crowdfunding is very time consuming. So we all have to learn how to do that better and more efficiently and act as a service organization for the journalists so they can concentrate on the reporting. It should be hopefully our job to invest in the campaign for them. As for the donors, I think one thing we've seen, even with trying to fundraise for our own money to get this project off the ground, I had to really convince one of our traditional donors to see it as something like a startup, as it were. But that donor does not traditionally fund startups. So it happened that our project officer there had to go to her board and really present this as something new and exciting for the foundation to support that could hopefully revolutionize how independent media is funded and so on. But it was a difficult sell for a traditional donor. And I've been talking to many other traditional donors with no success to get the funding. In the end, we got the funding from the new Google D&I program, the Digital News Innovation Award, where we were one of the recipients recently. They're obviously trying to see this in a little bit different way from traditional donors. The traditional donors, I think, have to really think much more like venture capitalists these days. I know Open Society Fund is moving or has moved in that direction to experiment, but the donor has to have the mentality these days that they're going to fund 10 projects, 2 or 3 of them might be really successful, a couple kind of might get by, and the rest will just fail. And that's the way things have to be if you're going to hope that a few of them succeed and succeed big. You can't have a traditional, we're going to just fund projects the way we've always funded projects. They turn in reports, they do a little bit incrementally to change things, and that's about it. It really needs that new mentality. My very last point, just for anyone who is interested about crowdfunding in general, the Pew Research Center did a very good report just looking at journalism projects funded by Kickstarter. I don't know, can we get the screen up here again, if it's possible? Yeah, so this is just some of the conclusions here. I'm not going to go through it, but this is just showing interest in crowdfunding over time from 2009, how many projects have been funded on Kickstarter, and then this is how much money has been donated. So in the big range of things, not talking about huge amounts of money, but still from January to September 2015 last year, it was $1.7 million. So the numbers are growing. There is potential there. Again, I don't want to be the guru of crowdfunding up here saying it's going to save everything, but you can see it is starting to make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Ayman Mana, Jeff.
That our friend Kate likes a lot, breaking silos. Actually, probably from what we heard, breaking silos between those working for independent journalism and those working for journalist safety is essential. Breaking silos between policymakers and people in the media assistance world is essential. Breaking silos with those working in the technology sector, in artificial intelligence, in big data is also important because the various sectors have to work together. But there are two words or three words that we didn't hear on the panel, and maybe the questions can tackle these points. The link with public service and independent journalism. The link with media literacy. I think it's something that Kate's slightly tackled. And the last point that I also would like to mention is, for example, in some of the areas where independent journalism is very difficult, like the Middle East, access to satellite TV. When you have Nilesat or Arabsat completely controlled by governments, who has access to satellite is also a big essential issue. So I won't talk more. The first hand I saw was over there. Yes, please.
My name is, well, it's okay? Okay. My name is Jean-Paul Martos. I'm based in Brussels. I work for the Committee to Protect Journalists, but also I'm a journalist. And I would like to just mention a report which was published 2 months ago in France concerning the attacks on the press. And this report shows that most of the attacks on the press in France, but also it could be extended to other countries like Belgium or Germany or other countries, doesn't come from the state. It comes from the owners and private actors. And it brings us back to a movement that you might not remember because you're too young. In the 70s, there was a movement called the Newsroom Democracy Movement, or in France it was called the Movement for Journalist Societies, which tended to create a protection from journalists inside their own news organizations against the intrusion of the publishers in deciding what was going to be published or aired. It's led to a declaration which was signed here in Milano in 1982, which is called the Milano Declaration, on the creation of societies of journalists. And I can tell you, I have been a director and I've been an editor-in-chief of a number of magazines and newspapers. The only protection that journalists had against my own arbitrary power to impose upon them not to cover a story or to cover nicely an advertiser was the protection given by the fact that those journalists had been recognized as the co-owners of the moral and political capital of the newspaper, of the magazine, which gave them the right to say, no, we're not going to go against, we're not going to accept an imposition on journalists to do something. So
thank you, sir.
So I think there's something which
point.
Should be perhaps discussed too. I mean, independence is also in relation to those real powers within newsrooms.
Thank you very much. Your neighbor next to the window, please.
Hi, I'm Ibrahim Hilal from Al Jazeera. I'm puzzled with the word itself, independent or independent journalism and independent journalists. Do you think independent journalists are only those who are working for their own? Or can we have independent journalists working inside organizations who are trying to impose editorial line on them, but there are margins for some journalists to be independent? And supporting independent journalists who are working as private sector, especially in the Middle East, and you know more than me, that we have a lot of intruders who are actually supported by security services and getting financial support from European Union and some financial support from the West. But actually they are working as politically oriented journalists independently. I have a question about the business model. Do we have a business model? Can we think of a business model for journalism in general that we can act up to build? Or is it a successful business model can we study?
Thank you. The lady on the fourth row, please. Okay.
Yes, thank you. My name is Nadia Bellardi. I do intercultural work, and I've done a lot of work in community media. And I want to hear your opinion on the issue of ownership, because if we look at what has been done by community media for the past 30 years, and community media, for those who are not familiar with it, is third sector media, so neither public service nor private commercial. It is taking the issue of independence to its highest form, meaning that the media is owned by the people who work in it, by the community that this media serves. And I think it's both amazing and tragic that professional journalism is actually now having to resort to exactly the same funding strategies and fundraising challenges that we have been doing for 30 years. We've been funding local community radios with subscribers, with live concerts, with parties, with gadgets and merchandising and crowdfunding and whatnot. And I think it's extraordinary that high-quality investigative journalism is now having to do the same. And I really hope this is not where public service is going to end up. But the question was ownership. What happens when your one and only donor changes its view on what is worth funding?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Really interesting that the three first questions are somehow linked to the issue of ownership. Joyce Barnathan, please, on the fourth row here. And then we'll have a first round of answers.
Joyce Barnathan, International Center for Journalists. This is not to diminish all the criticisms and all the challenges that independent media face. But as Carolyn said, this week we've had the most phenomenal impact we could even think of. I think this is a moment to be taking stock of what we're doing right. We have had 400 investigative journalists work around the world, kept this story quiet, broke it, have brought down the Prime Minister of Iceland, and that's just for starters. So you can be talking about investigative journalism, but there's been a huge proliferation of investigative journalism units. Yes, the financial struggles are there, but we're at an inflection point where journalists are doing amazing stuff right now. And I think if we look at this as a case study in going forward and how we can make our case, it might be very valuable.
Thank you. Back to you.
Who wants to start?
With the positive.
So I had a quick look at the Twitter timeline and saw that there's a discussion about what I said about sort of innovation in third-tier media organizations. I think it's very difficult to encapsulate within a tweetable quote what is happening within the media industry right now. Just, that's a caveat. So I think there's also, going to the PSB or public service organizations, I think, there are many around the world that are really at the vanguard of innovation because sometimes they have funds or units that can sort of fly under the radar or try things out. They have lots of space to try things out. So there's experimentation happening in all sorts of places. And I think the only thing I would say is that, the thing that we're encouraged to do is be as absolutely open-minded about where this is coming from as possible. I think that segues pretty well into what you were saying about the community media. I spent a lot of last year looking at cooperative structures for media. And I would argue, and I had this conversation with some of the ICIJ people, that ICIJ's model internally is kind of a cooperative. It's a commons-based model. I think it's something that media organizations have not necessarily exploited to the degree that they could do. There's all sorts of interesting initiatives happening, but not generally involving major news organizations. And so for that, ICIJ's model, I think, is an absolutely extraordinary flag bearer for commons-based, cooperative models of doing journalism, but still being able to have individual impact as a single brand, make money off it, all of that kind of stuff. I think it's a really extraordinary thing. And then, I think the other two things that were brought up, ownership, oh my God, what a problem, in so many different places. But I think the thing that's interesting is through things like Panama Papers, hopefully, I haven't delved into the data with any degree of whatever. So I think it will be interesting to see whether there is media ownership information that comes out through there. I know that, I was working with some projects in Latin America where there's a lot happening around ownership and transparency in Europe, and it's beginning in lots of other places. So that sort of movement is moving. And then the last thing is, don't forget, lots of NGOs, of ours, Amnesty, others have tried to set up news services from outside of news, outside of journalism. One of the things that I talked to recently that was really interesting is the Greenpeace model. So Greenpeace UK is funding a thing called Energy Desk, and they also have an investigations unit. And it's entirely editorially independent, and it's funded by them, but they have an entirely sort of BBC and investigative journalist-based constructed team. So, you know, they have built a loyal following. They seem to be doing really well. So, you know, there are you know, people trying in lots of different places to support and sustain different kinds and different verticals of journalism that will, you know, do the kinds of things that everyone here has been talking about. So I think, you know, there's cause for optimism in lots of those different areas, but I think it's about focus and being open-minded and being a bit ruthless.
If we'll take 2 more questions from the public, and then we'll complete the round from the panel. This way, we'll make sure we're balanced.
I was told
Please.
we have 5 more minutes.
Exactly. Please, 30 seconds, and I'm really timing.
Hi, my name is Isabel Cuesta. I'm a freelance journalist. I would like to ask Gabriela, you mentioned diversifying funding. And I'm myself also a dancer, a choreographer of contemporary dance. And you mentioned people who have done like theater or like even festivals in Brazil. And from my own experience, I mean, I've been working for 20 years as an artist. That takes so much time, and it's not as successful either. So could you mention like specific examples of this kind of diversifying funding? And also, if you do so, how seriously will you be taken? Because
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any last comment? Otherwise, we'll directly move back to the panel. Okay.
Yeah, when I mentioned these cases, for example, the investigative theater or the Wisconsin Watch sculptors, I'm not saying that with this you will get rich or the organization it's safe because they can do a sculpture, but it's just like little by little things that can get you connect with your audience and with potential new donors that maybe they get interested in this because of the art side, etc. So examples that to diversify, there are a lot. I don't know, I was reading someone that was trying to create like little parties for new potential donors. So yeah, but I know art is time consuming, doing a festival is art consuming and it's not going to save your finances, but it's just a new way to show yourself and to try to go out there and display your work, because that's what's important at the end. You don't need to lose focus that if you want to do investigative reporting, the main thing is quality journalism and the stories, and then you need to go out there and try to show yourself.
Thank you. We can move to Jeremy and Kate. Jeremy, please.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think you said it's tragic that the traditional journalism is looking to community radio for models, but in some ways I think that's encouraging, that they're thinking out of the box a little bit and going back to the methods that do work on a smaller scale. I mean, it's kind of silly, but the market drives done for public radio over the years, I mean, that is crowdfunding. It's just today we kind of call crowdfunding something different, but I think that's part of the future, is how can we involve the crowd, not just in one-time donations, but also thinking about in terms of, and we just mentioned ownership, in terms of different ownership models and experimenting with that. I met one guy who was trying to start up a kind of common marketplace where independent publications could put up part of their publication for sale to their most loyal readers. So I think that's quite interesting. I don't know, probably other people on the panel know more models like that, but I think that's quite interesting, where you take your loyal readers who almost look to these independent publications in certain countries almost like cults, that they want to keep going no matter what. And till now, all they could do is really take out a subscription. Maybe make a donation if that was a nonprofit or not, but otherwise just take out a subscription. What about offering those people 2% equity in that publication? And then you start to think of these different models. And I think just the last point there is it's really important to think not simply of commercial and nonprofit, but these kind of hybrid models, of which we're doing, a lot of people are doing, where you are able to take advantage of getting grants, but also having commercial operations. And it doesn't mean if you take grants that you're not a sustainable entity. The goal, which we haven't achieved, is not to be overly grant dependent. But it doesn't mean simply that grants cannot be part of a sustainable future. And you have to be solely commercial, which I think is the old way of thinking as well.
Thank you. Kate, and the link with policy.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder just about the question about what is independent. I might be skewing your question a little bit, and I am not speaking from a position of someone that is themselves involved in the media sector. But from my perspective and the sort of policy context that I'm talking about, I think it's what is most important is not necessarily whether you're independent or whether you're with, you know, a really big organization, but it's about integrity and having the space from your editor to investigate and then to convey your findings honestly. And I think that editors have to have the confidence to do that. And also it's about responsibility. I don't know if that ties in necessarily with the issue of media literacy, but it's about building skills and understanding and expanding and having the confidence to push those boundaries and create those spaces, I think.
Thank you very much for the answers you gave, but also for all the questions that you raised that you can continue to discuss directly through our website and engage with us on gfmd.info. And many of these points will be at the center stage at the World Forum for Media Development that GFMD is organizing in Jakarta from September 20th to 22nd in Jakarta in September. Check our website again, gfmd.info, for more details about the forum, for potential registration, and we'll be very happy to stay in touch with you. Thank you again, Jeremy, Kate, Caroline, Samir, and Gabby. Thank you very much for it.